The room was quiet except for the soft scratching of pencils and the hum of a single ceiling fan. Outside, Tokyo was cold, gray, and weary. It was late 1943. The war had dragged on for 2 years, and Japan's generals gathered inside the Imperial Army General Staff Headquarters. Maps of the Pacific covered the walls, each one marked with red and blue pins. The red showed Japanese positions. The blue showed the Americans. Over time, the blue had begun to spread, creeping across the Pacific like an incoming tide. On a long table sat a stack of fresh intelligence reports. A young officer placed the final folder before the senior generals and stepped back. General Hajime Sugiyama adjusted his glasses and opened the file. Inside were numbers, columns of them, representing the enemy's strength. He read silently at first, then his eyes widened. He passed the paper to the man beside him. Soon the entire table was bent over the pages, their expressions tight and pale. The reports told of America's full mobilization. The United States, with its vast population and industrial base, had reached a total force of 12 million men under arms. These numbers included the Army, the Navy, the Marines, and support personnel. Even more startling was how quickly this army had been raised and equipped. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles had been retooled to produce weapons on a scale Japan could hardly imagine. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines by the thousands each month. Liberty ships, built to carry troops and supplies, were launched at such speed that new ones slid into the water every few days. The generals spoke in clipped tones, each man struggling to grasp the scale. Until now, many had assumed that America's main focus was in Europe, where fighting raged against Germany and Italy. Japan believed this would give them room to maneuver in the Pacific. These reports shattered that belief. Even while sending millions of soldiers to Europe, America could still deploy vast forces to the Pacific. In comparison, Japan's total manpower peaked at around 6 million. Much of it was scattered across China, Burma, and countless islands. Japan's navy, once dominant, now struggled to replace ships lost in earlier battles. A colonel unrolled a large map on the table. Blue pins dotted the Central Pacific, showing American advances through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. He pointed to supply lines stretching back to Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast. "Even if we destroy one fleet," he said, "another will replace it." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. A war of attrition favored the side with greater resources, and America had almost limitless resources. The intelligence reports went beyond troop numbers. They detailed production figures that seemed unreal. In the previous year alone, America had built nearly 300,000 aircraft. Tanks, trucks, rifles, and artillery pieces were being produced in quantities that dwarfed Japanese output. Japan's factories, many still using outdated equipment, simply could not keep pace. Shortages of steel, fuel, and rubber grew worse each month. American submarines prowled the seas, sinking Japanese cargo ships and cutting vital supply lines. Without supplies, soldiers in the field fought with dwindling ammunition and limited food. As the generals studied the reports, tension rose in the room. Some argued for launching one last offensive to strike a decisive blow before America's strength became overwhelming. Others urged a shift to a purely defensive strategy, focusing on fortifying key islands to delay the inevitable advance. Voices grew louder, tempers flared, but no one offered a solution that could truly change the balance of power. General Tojo, who also served as prime minister, listened without speaking. His face remained impassive, but his hands gripped the edge of the table. The numbers before him told a grim story. Japan had entered the war with bold ambitions, striking across the Pacific and Southeast Asia in a series of rapid victories. Now those victories seemed hollow. The empire was stretched thin, its forces scattered and exhausted. In contrast, the United States was only growing stronger. The reports included photographs smuggled out by spies and reconnaissance planes. One showed a shipyard in California, rows of Liberty ships lined up like soldiers ready for inspection. Another showed a factory floor packed with women operating heavy machinery, producing aircraft engines around the clock. These images made the threat tangible. It was not just numbers on a page. It was an entire nation mobilized for war. One young officer, barely in his 20s, stood silently at the back of the room. He had never been to America, but he stared at the photos with a mix of awe and fear. Later, he would write in his diary that this was the moment he understood the war could not be won. Others in the room shared his unspoken realization, though none dared to say it aloud. The meeting stretched into the evening. Maps were marked and remarked, strategies debated, contingencies considered. Yet as the night wore on, the truth became clear. No matter how clever their tactics, the generals faced an opponent whose sheer scale rendered such plans almost meaningless. Even if Japan won a battle here or there, America's reserves could simply replace what was lost and continue forward. In the following days, Japanese forces received orders to strengthen defenses on key islands like Saipan, Guam, and Iwo Jima. Troops dug bunkers, laid mines, and prepared for the onslaught they knew was coming. Meanwhile, American factories continued to churn out weapons and ships, feeding an army that seemed endless. By early 1944, the blue pins on the maps spread farther across the Pacific. Each one represented a new landing, a new foothold gained by American forces. The Japanese High Command watched these changes with growing unease. The reports kept coming, each one confirming what they already knew deep down. They were fighting a giant, and the giant was now fully awake. Inside the headquarters, the air grew heavy with smoke and frustration. Generals pored over their plans, but their discussions lacked the confidence of earlier years. They had once believed that skill and courage could overcome material disadvantage. Now they faced a war defined by production, logistics, and overwhelming numbers. The realization settled over them like a cold weight. For the first time, some began to wonder not how they would win, but how long they could hold out. The intelligence reports were spread out across the table like a battlefield. Each sheet carried a weight far heavier than paper. Numbers filled the pages, cold and unyielding, spelling out a truth that the generals in Tokyo could not ignore. America had brought its full strength to bear, and that strength was vast beyond imagination. The reports broke down the enemy's forces in precise detail. 12 million men were now under arms. The figure included soldiers of the Army, the Marines storming beaches in the Pacific, the sailors of the Navy who carried them across oceans, and the countless support troops who kept the machine running. America's strength was not just in its soldiers, but in the immense web of logistics behind them. Railroads moved equipment across the continent. Trains loaded with tanks, artillery, and rifles ran day and night without pause. From those rail lines, cargo flowed into ports along the west coast. Ships carried the supplies westward, forming lifelines that stretched from San Francisco to Hawaii and beyond. Every man who fought on the front lines was supported by many more working behind him. The reports noted this with precision, as if to emphasize the gap between the two nations. Factories across the United States had been converted to war production at a speed and scale that stunned observers. Entire industries shifted focus within months. Car plants in Detroit no longer produced civilian automobiles. Instead, they turned out tanks and armored vehicles. In California, aircraft factories ran 3 shifts a day. In 1943 alone, America produced nearly 300,000 aircraft. Bombers, fighters, and transport planes rolled off assembly lines in an endless stream. It was a figure so large that one general whispered it had to be an exaggeration. The intelligence officer calmly assured him it was accurate. Shipyards worked with the same intensity. Photographs smuggled out by spies showed rows of Liberty ships under construction. These vessels were simple cargo carriers, designed to be built quickly and in huge numbers. The reports listed a total of 2,700 Liberty ships completed so far, with more on the way. Some were launched only weeks after construction began. These ships ferried troops, tanks, and supplies to distant fronts, ensuring that no American unit went without food or ammunition. The scale of the operation was staggering. For the Japanese generals, this was the most troubling revelation. Their own navy had suffered heavy losses in battles like Midway and Guadalcanal. Replacing a single aircraft carrier took years and resources Japan no longer had. In contrast, America could lose a carrier and have another ready within months. Even destroyers and cruisers, complex ships requiring skilled labor, were being produced faster than Japan could sink them. The balance of naval power was tilting sharply, and the reports made clear it would only grow worse. The numbers went beyond ships and planes. American factories produced millions of rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces. Tanks rolled out of factories by the tens of thousands, each one a product of industrial systems operating at full efficiency. Trucks and jeeps, often overlooked in combat reports, were essential to the movement of supplies and troops. America's ability to build and maintain these vehicles allowed its armies to fight across vast distances without pause. Japan's own production figures were pitiful by comparison. At its peak, the Japanese army fielded roughly 6 million men. Many of these were stationed in China or on garrison duty across the Pacific. Only a fraction were available for frontline combat in critical theaters like the Marianas or the Philippines. Even these forces were poorly supplied. Fuel shortages plagued every branch of the military. Steel, vital for ships and aircraft, was scarce. Rubber for tires and gaskets had to be imported from distant colonies, often at great risk from American submarines. The reports described the effect of these shortages in blunt terms. Aircraft sometimes sat idle for lack of spare parts. Ships went to sea with just enough fuel for a single mission, then returned to harbor and waited for the next ration of oil. Soldiers in remote outposts received dwindling supplies of food and ammunition. In some cases, troops resorted to foraging or capturing supplies from local populations. These conditions made it impossible to match the relentless pace of the American advance. Maps in the report illustrated the logistical situation in stark visual form. Thick blue lines marked American supply routes, wide and secure, supported by fleets of transport ships. Thin red lines showed Japanese routes, narrow and fragile, often severed by enemy submarines or airstrikes. The comparison was like a river versus a trickling stream. Every officer in the room understood what this meant. Wars were not won by courage alone. They were won by sustained force, and sustained force required logistics. As the session continued, the intelligence officer laid out figures for American troop training. Camps across the United States were filled with new recruits. Thousands of men completed training each week and were shipped to embarkation points. The flow of reinforcements seemed endless. Even as battles raged in Europe, fresh divisions were already earmarked for the Pacific. This dual-front capability was something Japan had never considered possible. They had assumed America would need to choose between Europe and the Pacific. The reports showed that assumption had been a grave mistake. One general leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. The others sat in silence, staring at the numbers. These were not just statistics. They were a measure of the challenge before them. Japan had started the war believing that superior tactics and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. In the early victories, this belief seemed justified. But now, faced with the reality of American production, that belief was crumbling. In a final summary, the intelligence officer compared total production outputs side by side. The disparity was overwhelming. America's factories produced more aircraft in a single year than Japan could in the entire war. Its shipbuilding output dwarfed anything Japan could hope to match. Even basic rifles and ammunition were produced on a scale that seemed almost unreal. The report ended with a simple conclusion. America's war machine was not just powerful. It was unstoppable. The room remained silent for a long time after he finished speaking. The generals exchanged glances, each man weighing the implications. They knew these figures would shape every decision in the coming months. The enemy's strength was now clear, and with that clarity came a grim understanding. Japan was no longer fighting an equal. It was fighting a force whose size and reach could engulf the entire Pacific. The room smelled of ink and tobacco smoke. A cold wind rattled the windows, but no one seemed to notice. The generals sat in a tight circle around the large wooden table, their faces tense and drawn. A young colonel entered carrying a rolled map under his arm. He bowed quickly, then spread the map across the table. The paper rustled as heavy hands pressed it flat. The map showed the entire world, with the Pacific Ocean at its center. Red pins marked Japanese positions, stretching from Burma to the Marshall Islands. Blue pins marked American forces. At first, the blue was scattered, thin lines radiating from Hawaii and Australia. But as the officers looked closer, they saw how the blue had grown thicker over time. The lines now extended deep into the Central Pacific and toward the Philippines. It looked like a net closing in. The colonel tapped the western half of the map. "This is Europe," he said, his voice calm but firm. Blue lines there were dense, running across Britain and into Italy. The Americans were fighting Germany on one side of the world while pushing toward Japan on the other. The colonel paused to let the point sink in, then moved his hand across the Pacific. "Even with millions of men deployed in Europe, they can still send millions more here. These forces are dedicated to this theater alone." The room went silent. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. The implications were clear. Japan had once counted on America being too distracted by Europe to commit fully to the Pacific. That hope was gone. The enemy's strength was greater than anything they had imagined. General Tojo leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the map. "How many divisions are active in the Pacific now?" he asked. 35. The colonel answered without hesitation, "with more in reserve." "And Europe?" "Over 60 divisions, with reinforcements arriving every month." A low murmur spread through the room. It was one thing to read numbers in a report. It was another to see them represented like this, blue markers stretching across two oceans. Another officer spoke, his voice sharp. "Even if we destroy one fleet, another will arrive." The colonel nodded grimly. "Yes, their industrial output makes this inevitable. Every ship sunk today will be replaced within months. Every aircraft lost will be rebuilt. Their supply lines are secure and wide." The generals turned their attention to the red pins. These represented Japan's defensive perimeter. It curved around the empire's holdings, a vast arc of islands and bases meant to block the enemy's advance. But the arc was fraying. American forces had already broken through in the Gilberts and Marshalls. They were moving closer to the Marianas and the Philippines. Each island that fell became a new base for the next attack. One senior admiral jabbed a finger at the map. "This is their strategy," he said. "Island hopping. They bypass strong points, cut them off, and move forward. Our garrisons are stranded. They cannot fight back without supplies. Once cut off, they wither." His words carried the weight of bitter experience. Many in the room had already received reports of starving troops left behind on bypassed islands. These men were isolated without hope of rescue. It was a slow, grinding form of warfare, and the Americans had perfected it. The colonel continued his briefing. He pointed to the Philippine Sea. "They are preparing for a major offensive here. Once they capture these islands, our southern resource area will be cut off. No fuel, no rubber, no steel. Without these, our forces cannot continue to fight." The image of encirclement became clear. If the Philippines fell, Japan would be severed from its colonies. The home islands would stand alone, surrounded and vulnerable. General Sugiyama broke the silence. "If they take the Marianas, they will have bases for their heavy bombers. They could strike the home islands directly." A hush fell over the room. No one needed to explain what that meant. The war would come to Japan's cities and factories. Civilian areas would no longer be safe. One officer clenched his fists. "We are facing an enemy with limitless resources," he said bitterly. The colonel nodded again. "Their manpower and production make it so. This is not speculation. It is fact." The tension in the room grew thicker. Some argued for a decisive battle, one massive engagement to cripple the enemy's fleet and force negotiations. Others urged caution, preferring to pull back and strengthen defensive positions. The debate grew heated. An admiral slammed his hand on the table. "If we scatter our forces, we will be defeated in detail," he warned. "We must concentrate and strike at their next landing." A general countered, "And if we fail, we will have no reserves. The homeland will be defenseless." The argument circled, but no clear answer emerged. All strategies seemed inadequate against an enemy of such scale. As the discussion dragged on, the colonel quietly packed his notes. He had delivered the message he was ordered to give, though he took no satisfaction in it. These were not just numbers or maps. They represented lives, battles, and the fate of the nation. By nightfall, the meeting ended without resolution. The generals left in small groups, their faces lined with exhaustion. Outside, Tokyo streets were dark under the blackout. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the blue pins were moving closer, carried forward by a tide of men and machines that showed no sign of slowing. In the war room, the map remained spread across the table. The red perimeter still curved around the empire, but everyone who had seen it knew the truth. The arc was shrinking, and the enemy's reach was growing. Each new blue pin placed on that map was another step toward Japan's heart. The meeting broke apart slowly, like a ship caught on a reef. The generals and staff officers left the room in silence, their footsteps echoing down the dim hallways of the headquarters. Outside, the winter air cut sharp and cold through their uniforms. Tokyo was dark under strict blackout rules. No lights showed from the windows. The city felt like it was holding its breath. Inside, a few officers lingered near the map table. They spoke in low voices, glancing at the door to be sure no one overheard. Their words were cautious, their faces guarded. Some still believed victory was possible. Others, though they did not say it outright, had begun to doubt the war itself. The scale of the numbers they had just seen made their arguments seem small and hollow. One general slammed his fist against the table. "We must strike with everything we have," he said. His voice carried more anger than conviction. "We cannot allow the enemy to keep advancing. A decisive battle is the only way to change the course of this war." An admiral shook his head. "And where will we find the fuel to launch such a strike?" he asked. "Our tankers are at the bottom of the sea. Our pilots fly on rations. We send our ships out with just enough oil to reach the battlefield and return, if they return at all." The general turned on him sharply. "Then we gather every last drop and use it for one purpose. We fight them at sea, and we break them in one blow." The admiral's eyes narrowed. "If we fail, there will be nothing left. No reserves. No defense for the homeland." Their voices grew louder until a senior staff officer stepped between them. He raised his hands, urging calm. The argument ended, but no agreement was reached. Each man knew what the other feared to say aloud. The enemy had resources that Japan could not match. Even the most daring plan was only a gamble against impossible odds. Far away, across the ocean, a different scene unfolded. In a factory in Detroit, women worked on an assembly line building aircraft engines. Their hands were black with grease, their faces tired but determined. The noise was deafening. Hammers striking metal, machines clattering, voices calling out instructions. A foreman walked along the line, checking the engines as they passed. In another plant, men loaded shells onto conveyor belts, preparing them for shipment overseas. Trucks rumbled through the night carrying crates of rifles and ammunition to waiting trains. The contrast was stark. While Japanese officers argued over dwindling supplies, American production surged ahead without pause. Civilians worked long shifts, knowing their labor directly supported soldiers fighting on distant islands. Posters on factory walls urged them to produce more, work harder, and never let the troops down. It was a war effort that united an entire nation. Back in Tokyo, a young lieutenant sat alone in his small office. He had been present at the briefing earlier in the day, though he had not spoken. His task was to record the minutes of the meeting and distribute them to higher command. Now he stared at his notes, the words blurring before his eyes. 12 million men. The figure seemed unreal, like something from a nightmare. He reached for his diary, a worn notebook tucked in his uniform pocket. By the light of a single candle, he began to write. His handwriting was neat and steady, though his thoughts were heavy. He described the map with its creeping blue pins, the cold faces of the generals, the sharp exchange between the admiral and the general. He wrote of his own feelings, ones he dared not speak aloud. "We are told to fight to the last," he wrote. "We are told that victory is still possible if we show enough spirit. But how can spirit defeat such numbers? Even if we destroy a fleet, another will come. Even if we hold an island, they will take the next. Their resources have no end. Ours grow smaller each day." He paused, listening to the quiet of the building. The only sound was the distant rumble of trains, moving troops and supplies somewhere into the night. He dipped his brush in ink and continued. "I fear we are walking toward defeat, though no one will admit it. If the people knew the truth, they would despair. Perhaps they already suspect." He closed the diary and slipped it back into his pocket. The candle burned low, casting long shadows across the desk. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the city in a thin white layer. It seemed to mute the world, hiding its scars for a moment. In the coming days, orders went out for a major naval operation. The plan was bold: to gather what remained of the fleet and strike the Americans in a single, decisive battle. Many whispered that it would take place near the Philippines, where the enemy's advance threatened to cut Japan's empire in two. The men who crafted the plan spoke of victory, but those who would carry it out knew the risks. At sea, fuel shortages forced captains to make careful calculations. Ships sailed with just enough oil to reach their target. Pilots trained in secret, some knowing they might not return. Every man understood that this battle could decide the fate of the empire. Meanwhile, the factories in America worked without interruption. A shipyard on the West Coast launched a new Liberty ship every few days. Workers cheered as each vessel slid into the water, ready to carry men and machines across the ocean. The young lieutenant heard rumors of these factories. He pictured them as he had seen in the photographs smuggled back by spies. Endless rows of machines, conveyor belts moving with steady precision, crowds of workers focused on their tasks. It was a vision of strength unlike anything he had known. He returned to his diary and wrote one final line before extinguishing the candle. "We face a nation that fights with its entire heart and body. How long can we stand against such a force?" The room fell into darkness. In the distance, the low sound of the city remained, a reminder that the war continued, relentless and unstoppable. The months that followed the intelligence briefing were marked by a slow but unmistakable shift. Japan no longer planned sweeping offensives. The bold strikes that had defined the early years of the war were over. The generals knew it, though few said it openly. Every new order, every redeployment, carried the same unspoken message: hold as long as possible, no matter the cost. Across the Pacific, the Americans kept coming. Their movements were precise and constant, like a machine that never stopped. Each time a Japanese garrison prepared for battle, another force appeared somewhere else, striking at a weak point. The map in the Tokyo War Room filled with new blue pins. The generals erased red ones that marked islands now lost. The pattern was clear. The enemy had momentum, and there was no way to slow it. The Philippines became the focus of the struggle. These islands were a vital link between Japan and the southern territories that supplied oil, rubber, and food. If they fell, the empire would be cut off. Japan gathered its remaining strength for a massive naval battle, hoping to break the American advance in a single, decisive clash. The plan was daring but risky. Ships were fueled with the last reserves of oil. Pilots were briefed on missions that allowed no mistakes. The battle came in October 1944, near the island of Leyte. It was one of the largest naval battles in history. Japanese ships fought with skill and courage, but they faced an opponent with greater numbers and resources. Even when Japanese units struck hard, fresh American reinforcements arrived. For every ship Japan lost, it had no replacement. America replaced its losses almost as quickly as they occurred. When the fighting ended, the Japanese fleet was shattered. Many of its largest ships lay on the ocean floor. The defeat marked the end of Japan's ability to fight at sea as an equal power. From then on, the empire could only defend, never attack. With the sea lanes broken, supplies to outlying islands dwindled. Garrisons went hungry. Some units received no shipments of ammunition or medicine for weeks. Messages from these positions grew desperate, then stopped altogether. American submarines patrolled the waters, sinking transport ships and further isolating Japanese forces. What had once been a vast empire now felt like a series of disconnected outposts, each one cut off from the others. On land, the Americans pressed their advantage. They launched a series of assaults across the Pacific, moving steadily closer to Japan itself. At Iwo Jima, the defenders dug deep into tunnels and bunkers, determined to make the enemy pay for every inch of ground. They fought fiercely, but the overwhelming firepower of the American forces broke through. Thousands died defending the island, but the loss was inevitable. When it ended, the Americans had gained a base close enough to launch direct bombing raids on the Japanese home islands. Okinawa followed soon after. This battle was even more brutal. Japanese commanders knew it was their last barrier before the mainland. Every soldier was told to fight to the death. Civilians were caught in the middle, many forced to take part in the defense. The Americans came in massive numbers, supported by ships and aircraft that darkened the sky. During this time, Japan introduced a new tactic born of desperation. Pilots volunteered for missions with no return. Their planes were loaded with explosives and sent to crash into enemy ships. These attacks, called kamikaze, caused heavy damage and struck fear into the American fleet. But for each ship hit, many more remained. The losses inflicted could not change the course of the war. The tactics symbolized Japan's growing desperation. It was not a strategy of victory, but of delay. As the battles raged, the Americans kept up a relentless pace. Their manpower seemed endless. New divisions rotated into combat while others rested and refitted. Supplies flowed steadily across the ocean. Liberty ships carried everything from tanks to food to medical equipment. Even as one operation ended, the next was already planned. The pressure never eased. In Tokyo, the reports arriving from the front grew grim. Commanders described units reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Entire regiments disappeared in the jungle or on isolated atolls. The generals marked these losses on their maps, but the blue pins continued to advance. There was no pause, no reprieve. The isolation of the home islands deepened. With supply lines severed, factories ran short of raw materials. Fuel was rationed to the point where some planes never left the ground. Ships stayed in port, unable to sail for lack of oil. Soldiers drilled with wooden rifles when metal was unavailable. The shortages touched every part of the military. Morale began to falter. In private, some officers admitted what they had long suspected. The war could no longer be won. Yet the official orders remained the same. Every battle was to be fought to the last man. Every position was to be held, no matter how hopeless. This doctrine of total resistance consumed lives and resources at a staggering rate. Meanwhile, American bombers struck with growing intensity. Cities burned night after night. The population endured hunger and fear, even as they were told to continue supporting the war effort. The people were never shown the full truth. They did not see the reports that piled up on the generals' desks. They did not hear the quiet conversations where defeat was acknowledged but never spoken aloud. By mid-1945, the pattern was unbreakable. Each new American assault followed the same path. Overwhelming firepower, rapid landings, secure supply lines. Japanese defenders fought with courage, but they were outnumbered and undersupplied. Their sacrifices slowed the enemy but could not stop them. The empire that had once stretched across the Pacific was now shrinking rapidly. Each lost island brought the war closer to Japan's shores. The strategy had shifted completely. No one spoke of victory anymore. The only question was how long they could hold before the tide consumed them entirely. The war ended with silence more powerful than any battle. Japan's cities lay in ruins. Smoke still hung over Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. Rail lines were twisted, ports were shattered, and factories were nothing but shells. The once vast empire had vanished. Soldiers who had been scattered across distant islands were dead, captured, or slowly making their way home to a country they no longer recognized. The surviving generals walked through the same war rooms where they had once argued about strategy. The maps were gone now. The walls were bare. The long tables were empty except for a few stacks of reports. These reports no longer spoke of new offensives or troop movements. Instead, they listed the names of the missing, the dead, and the displaced. In the weeks after the surrender, foreign officers arrived in Tokyo to oversee the occupation. Among them were Americans who had studied those same maps during the war, the men who had planned the very operations that had crushed Japan's defenses. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The Japanese commanders, once so confident, now sat quietly as the victors explained the terms of surrender. There were no heated debates anymore, only nods and silence. As Japan came under Allied control, many officers began to reflect on the war in private. In conversations behind closed doors, they spoke about what had gone wrong. Some blamed specific battles. Others blamed the Navy or the Army or the government. But the truth they returned to again and again was the one they had seen in those intelligence reports years earlier. The numbers had been clear. America's strength was not just in its soldiers, but in its factories, railroads, and shipyards. The enemy had mobilized its entire population. Men fought overseas while women and older workers kept the production lines running at home. Supplies moved from farm to factory to front line with seamless precision. One former staff officer later wrote in his memoir that the war had been lost before some of its most famous battles were even fought. "We were never fighting only soldiers," he said. "We were fighting an entire nation that could replace every loss and still grow stronger." In the months that followed, American officials took Japanese leaders on tours of the United States. They visited factories in Detroit, shipyards in California, and farms in the Midwest. For many Japanese officers, this was the first time they saw with their own eyes what had been described in those wartime reports. Miles of assembly lines, fields stretching to the horizon, trains loaded with goods. Some stood silently, realizing how impossible it had been to match that level of production. This experience left a deep mark. Japan's military tradition had been built on the idea that skill and bravery could overcome material disadvantage. For centuries, that belief had guided strategy. The war had shattered it. Modern warfare, they now understood, depended as much on industry and logistics as on tactics and courage. A modern army could not fight without a modern economy behind it. The realization shaped Japan's future. In the years after the surrender, the country rebuilt itself with these lessons in mind. Factories were repaired and retooled, not for war, but for peace. The same industrial energy that had once produced rifles and warships now produced cars, radios, and household goods. Railroads were rebuilt to move goods for commerce instead of armies. Many of the same officers who had commanded during the war now spoke openly about avoiding future conflicts. They urged Japan to focus on economic strength rather than military power. Pacifism became a central part of the nation's new identity. The sight of destroyed cities and the memory of overwhelming defeat reinforced the idea that war brought only ruin. For the Americans, the war confirmed their position on the world stage. By defeating both Germany and Japan at the same time, the United States had proven that it could project power across the globe. Its massive mobilization during the war laid the foundation for a permanent military presence overseas. Bases were established in Europe and Asia, and American ships patrolled distant seas. In Tokyo, Japanese citizens watched as American planes flew overhead, not to bomb, but to deliver food and supplies. The same logistical networks that had carried destruction now carried relief. For many, this was their first direct encounter with the scale of American resources. The war had shown what those resources could do when used for conquest. The occupation showed what they could do when used for rebuilding. Young officers who had survived the war wrote about these experiences in journals and letters. One wrote, "I believed that courage could match any enemy. I now see that courage must be supported by preparation and strength. We fought an enemy who never ran out of either." His words echoed the thoughts of many veterans. As Japan rebuilt, this understanding spread through the population. Schools taught the history of the war not as a series of battles, but as a lesson in cause and effect. Children learned how shortages of oil, steel, and food had weakened their country before the first shot was fired. They learned how industrial power could determine the outcome of wars fought across oceans. The memory of defeat remained sharp. Even years later, when Japan's cities were bustling again, older citizens remembered the hunger, the bombings, and the fear of invasion. Factories once again filled with workers, but now their labor went toward consumer goods and export trade. The shift was deliberate. Japan's leaders understood that economic success would bring security in a way that military victories never had. Across the Pacific, American leaders also remembered. The experience of mobilizing 12 million men and supporting them across two vast oceans changed how the United States viewed its role in the world. It emerged from the war not just as a victor, but as a global superpower. Its industrial base had been tested and proven. Its logistical systems had connected continents. For Japan, the war was a harsh teacher. For America, it was a proving ground. The lessons learned on both sides would shape the decades that followed. What began as a clash of armies had become a story of nations, economies, and the immense power of modern mobilization. The maps that once showed red and blue pins were gone, but their meaning lived on in the choices each country made as they moved forward into a new era.